recently I was on social media, which is always a mistake, and I saw that someone from a popular podcast, YouTube show, had put up a tweet attacking Robert E. Lee, which is in fashion in the United States. So he had made a point that was different than somewhat I've seen before, in which people have said, well, Robert E. Lee was a slave owner, or he supported the South, and the South supported slavery, so we shouldn't, honor him or have statues. And that's a fair point. But what he said was, well, not only that, but, why is it that some Americans still see him as a hero? He's equivalent to Himmler or Bin Laden. And I replied to the tweet and I said, well, you seem to not understand the notion of the fact that it was a civil war. It wasn't America fighting some foreign enemy. This was Americans on both sides. So it's a bit more complex. And then I got a huge number of replies. I'm sorting through the ones that say, well, you're just a moron, an idiot, and a racist. But many of them basically said the same thing, which is Robert E. Lee and the Confederates were traitors. Why would you honor a traitor? It's treason. And I saw a lot of that, and it occurs to me that the United States today uses the word traitor and treason a lot. Much more so than when I was a kid. So I was surprised to hear this term, because I grew up reading about the Civil War, and I grew up in Maine, where obviously it was a Union state, and Maine played an important role in the war, especially through the 20th Maine, which was a regiment of volunteers that helped to play a very key part of the Battle of Gettysburg, and whose commander went on to much fame. So it never occurred to me, reading about the Civil War as a kid, or watching movies like Gettysburg, or listening to the Civil War documentary on PBS, that the South was seen as traitors. I mean, if they had been, then why weren't they hung? Now, the revolutionaries in 1775 and 76, they were viewed more as traitors to the crown. But the secession was viewed as a rebellion. And I understand when it comes to the Civil War, nothing's ever simple, because when I was a kid, I remember hearing these debates about, well, it was about states' rights. No, it was about slavery. No, you see, they were going to free the slaves anyway. Or, actually Lincoln didn't care about slavery either. When I was in high school, we had a teacher that once made us read a pamphlet called Lincoln, Anti-Slavery Advocate, or Honky. So, there's obviously a wide range of opinion about Lincoln and all these people, but I think there's not as wide a range, or traditionally was not as wide a range of opinion about the fact that most of those who served in the Confederate States of America Army, and many of whom were conscripts, or some of whom were, that these were Americans, and that they were in some cases cousins or brothers of other Americans, and that they didn't all go to war to defend slavery. They did. Many of them felt that they were going to war to defend their states. You could say, well, that's a bad cause. Well, maybe the fact is it isn't a good cause, but America was founded by men like Jefferson and Washington, so they owned slaves. America went to war in 1812 against the British Empire, right? So would we say, therefore, the Americans fighting in 1812, because some of them came from slave-owning states, that therefore they're just all bad people? I mean, by the logic that the problem is slavery, then they should also get rid of Monticello or whatever, and all these places that have to do with Jefferson and Washington. And yet people don't say that. They don't say that Jefferson and Washington are traitors. So what they're really saying is that the real problem with the South isn't even slavery. The new concept, the new narrative in America, it appears to be, is hatred of Lee and the Confederates as traitors. And It's interesting because I remember, when I was a kid, or not a kid, but in high school or university, we learned about the Rosenbergs and some of the cases where Americans actually did execute people for treason. And actually what we learned was, America went too far. There was a Red Scare and people were accused of treason. And okay, the Rosenbergs were spies, but should they really have executed them? What about Ethel Rosenberg, et cetera, et cetera? So it's unclear to me why it is that the South is viewed particularly as treasonous. Whereas you have people, for instance, in the protests of the Vietnam War, Jane Fonda or what have you, who supported the North, and, some of them waved North Vietnamese flags or whatever. I mean, we don't view those people as traitors, I don't think. I mean, there was a time maybe when there was a lot of hatred for Jane Fonda and some sectors, but that would be considered right-wing hatred, and accusing people of treason used to be something that the right wing used to do. And now it's become a more left or center left or leftist talking point, which is to throw around the word traitor all the time. So it seems to me just a fundamental and unfortunate misunderstanding of the Civil War. And it seems to me that it also goes along with a general decline in interest or knowledge of American history. And also a lack of empathy or real, intimacy with that history. When I was a kid, and this is not so long ago, in the 1980s or 90s, there wasn't a town in the north, in Massachusetts or Maine, that doesn't have a statue to the people that died in the Civil War. Very small towns sent a lot of people to fight. And that's the same in the South. And when you go to places like Gettysburg and you see the memorials on both sides of the line, it's clear that what's unique about the Civil War was that Lincoln and others wanted reconciliation. There wasn't this visceral hatred for these people. There were certainly, of course, extremists like John Brown, but there generally wasn't visceral hatred. And many years later, after Gettysburg, many of these people had reunions. And of course, it's true that in the South there was this concept of a lost cause or whatever. And it is true that Woodrow Wilson watched Birth of a Nation at the White House, and that's right. But what's not clear is how it's difficult to suddenly see all these people that fought for the South as not Americans. Well, they were Americans, and the North fought to keep them Americans. So when did they stop being Americans? Did they think that they weren't Americans? Did they call it the Confederate States of America? Well, what's this idea that it's some sort of foreign country? You can say what you will and say that slavery is wrong and racism is wrong, and the way in which the South, after the Reconstruction era, returned to its roots and segregation and all of this, that should all be condemned, and people should not feel sympathy with that institution or racism, and they should not feel that that's good. And if they want to condemn the South for all that, that's fine. But it doesn't seem to be helpful to reduce it to this kind of simplistic idiocy of just seeing it as a bunch of traitors.
Hear the battle cry of freedom, how it swells upon the air.